Hi everybody, I'm Pascal from ArtOfDrumming and welcome to part 2 of our Recreating Iconic Drum Sounds video on Ash Soan, where I show you how I did the mixes. Let's jump right in. So this is the Logic session that I mixed everything in. As you can see, up top we have the original song for reference, then we have the original drums for reference, the drumless playback, and then the drum mics we set up. All of these ones are the main drum mics for the main set. They're going into this drum bus. And then these are all of the overdubs. The first one you can ignore because it's a snare overdub channel that I didn't use. I didn't like the sound, so it's muted. But then we have the phone mic again. And then we have the tambourine mic. Cymbal swells, for that I just used the left overhead, copied the channel, and that's that. Then we have the left tom and right tom overdubs. I suggest we focus on the main drum set first. So let's listen to those the way they are in the mix. Now without the overdubs. So, how did I get this sound? The idea is to basically get all of the punch and body from the close mics and use the overheads for cymbals only. That's why, if we listen to those, we really only have the cymbals. And the way I did that was to do a low cut on both overheads. The CQ is the same for both of them. It's a very gradual low cut at about 3000 Hertz. And then I boosted some 10,000, about 7 decibels, to bring out the highs. And that's the same for both of them. So let's listen with that EQ on and with them being panned. And this plugin is because on the right overhead, I'm finding that the right cymbal has a little bit more attack than in the original recording. If we listen back with this plugin off and with these on, you'll notice that the right cymbal in my version has more attack, and I'm getting rid of that by using this enveloper shaper. And I'm removing some attack, turning down the gain here by 28%, and the attack time is about 20 milliseconds. So by doing that, I can get rid of some of the attack. Okay, so continuing on with the drum mics then. Here we have the hi-hat, which is just support, so dry, it sounds like this. Now if we come in here and look at the EQ, here also I did a low cut because I want only the hi-hat on this mic. No snare bleed or anything. That's why I'm cutting at 540 Hertz, this time also a bit steeper than before. And then I'm also removing some more highs on this one, because comparing back and forth my version with the original, I noticed that I was having more highs, but I wanted to bring up the hi-hat in total without making it overly sizzly. So that's why I'm removing that. Also, I'm removing some 6.5K and 1 resonance frequency. As you can see, this peak right here is now being removed. I think it just cleans up the signal a bit. Generally, all of these EQs I'm doing just to match our recordings with the original. I'm not really trying to bring out the most of what we recorded, but I'm making it sound like the recording. That's why I'm doing some of these weird EQ moves. Next up, we have the enveloper once again, and this time I'm removing some release gain, so I'm effectively shortening the hi-hat. Without this plugin, the hi-hat sounds has a longer sound, and with it, it's very short and controlled, as if I'd closed the hi-hat more while playing it. Now let's listen to the overheads and hi-hat in combination. So this is, this takes care of the cymbals, so to say. But then I also have the right mic here, and that's sounding like this. It was an M160, I think, above the right cymbal. So it's got quite a lot of mids in it, which I'm not really liking too much. That's why I'm cutting those as well here. And then while mixing this, I actually realized that probably Ash Soan used a large crash cymbal, which he wrote on for the recording. And we used a ride cymbal with more attack. So that's why I'm also removing some of the attack on the overhead. And also doing some of this EQ. So I want to bring out a little bit more high-end sustain. So I'm doing this boost above 9.5K here. And I'm also boosting 1700 Hertz roughly. Helps to bring out a little bit more of the trashy character of the cymbal and make it sound a bit more like a crash, I think. So now all of the cymbal mics in combination. And again, I got all of these adjustments here by listening back and forth between our recording and the original song. Next up, looking at the snare, this is what that sounds like dry. Actually a pretty good sounding snare already. The first thing I'm doing here is flipping the phase in order for it to be in phase with the overheads. I just turned this on and off while listening in combination with the overheads, and I found that this sounded the best. Then I'm doing the first EQ. I'm cutting here just below the fundamental of the drum, which is this, and then I'm cutting everything below that. And I'm also boosting 6.7K a bit, so bringing out a bit more of the snare wires and also some of the attack. Compared to I'm then compressing the signal. The settings for that are about 4:1 in terms of ratio, 29 milliseconds of attack, and 190 milliseconds of release, which are some pretty basic standard compressor adjustments for drum mixing, for me at least. And I'm making sure that the needle, the gain reduction here is not going over 5 decibels. And I actually want it to live right between 0 and -5. And then I'm also using some makeup gain just to make it a bit louder. Then we have the enveloper once again. This time we're bringing out some attack, just a little bit. So I'm boosting 26% and have the attack time set to 23 milliseconds. And then I'm also removing some sustain of the drum by turning the release down 10% for 150 milliseconds. So this makes the drum more punchy. Then I'm simulating some tape distortion by using the distortion plugin from Logic. And the way I set this up was not touch the tone knob. I don't want any EQ to happen here. I just want to add a little bit of grid to the signal. So 4 decibels of drive. And then I adjusted the output volume in such a way that the overall volume of the snare drum signal did not change. So no matter if I turn this on or off, it's going to be the same volume, but with it on, I'm getting some distortion. Compared to I think it adds a bit more character and also compresses the signal, which I find very helpful when mixing drums sometimes, in order to make sure that every snare hit is exactly the same volume. I sometimes like to use distortion, but not to get the character of it, really, but to use it kind of like a limiter. But in this case, I also want the grid. And then lastly, one more EQ. This one does another low cut because distortion always adds artificial low end, which is not part of the drum. So I'm cutting that below the fundamental again. I'm also boosting some of the fundamental. And I'm removing some mids at 374 Hertz minus roughly 11 decibels, which is quite a lot. Then I'm also adding a little bit more high end here at 7.75K, just a little bit. And I'm also boosting everything above roughly 8.8K to bring out a bit more attack and high end. So this is the signal dry. And this is it with all of the plugins. And by doing this, I'm actually getting so much high frequency information that I don't need the snare bottom mic. Initially I tried it, I did some EQ to that as well, but ended up not needing it, so that's why it's muted. Next up we have the bass drum. I was actually very happy with the way that the internal mic sounded. So happy, in fact, that I didn't use the out mic at all. So let's take a listen to the kick drum in microphone dry. Sorry, like this. So the first thing I'm doing is this EQ. This would probably be standard for a bass drum EQ. This would not. So let's focus on this for a second. Here I'm boosting some very, very low end, 45 Hertz, 7 dB, because the original recording has that as well. Usually I like to aim for about 60 Hertz in terms of kick drum fundamental or kick drum low end. But in this case, I had to boost in a lower range. And then I'm also removing some low mids here at roughly 100 Hertz, minus 6 dB. As you can see, these are also the frequencies that are in the drum. And then, if you listen to the original, you'll notice that the bass drum has more mids than this microphone has. But I found it easier to boost the mids in this mic than, for instance, to use this one, the out mic, and get them from there, and then having to deal with different levels and possibly phase issues. Didn't want any of that. I was lazy, so I just boosted some mids in this microphone. I did a very wide boost at roughly 550 Hertz, and then I added 8 decibels of that, which is quite a lot. Compared to the dry signal. I think the dry signal actually sounds better, but in this case it was not about better or worse, it was about recreating the original. So okay, next up we have the compressor again, and then once again I'm using about a 4:1 ratio, 29 milliseconds of attack and 260 milliseconds of release to make sure that the compressor stays active for as long as the drum decays. I think it just tightens up the signal a bit. It sounds a bit prettier, a bit more produced this way. And then I'm adding one other EQ. I'm boosting a little bit more of the low end here. The reason I'm not boosting before the compressor is because I want to use the compressor in order to shape the character of the drum. And if I had boosted this before, the compressor would act more strongly, or would react more strongly because of this low end, which has low end frequencies have more sonic energy. At least that's what I heard, and it makes sense to me. That's why the compressor acts more, but I want to have the compressor shape the signal and then add the amount of low end that I need. That's why I'm boosting after the compressor as well. And then I'm also boosting a little bit of attack at 3.5K, 2.2 dB of that. Okay. Next up, we have the two toms, the kit toms. Actually, I think they are not being played at all. Yeah, no. Okay, so here I have the kit toms. They're actually not being played in the song, but I still have them in the mix because we demonstrated how the kit sounds on its own, and I EQ'd them and mixed them in a way that I think fits the mix, fits the sound of the drums, but they're not actually part of the song. The way I did that was to go to the single hits we recorded for the demo, and I mixed them there. I think here is where I played them. Yes. So if we listen to this, this is what the toms sound like. On the 10-inch one, I just did a little bit of EQ. I lowered the volume because the 10-inch one for some reason had a little bit more gain on it, and I had to match it to the 16-inch one. So I did that here. And then I also removed a little bit of the fundamental because that was more present in the small tom than in the large tom. And then I cut just below the fundamental, just like I did on the snare. Then on the 16-inch, I also did the low cut. I boosted the fundamental and I removed some low mids. This made sure that the signals matched one another. And also one thing I like to do for this is open up the frequency analyzer. And if we take a look at the toms now, you can see that the 10-inch tom lives or goes up to about -20, and then the 16-inch one also lives in the same region. And that's making sure that the two toms fit one another. For panning the toms, I'm doing -20 to the left and 45 to the right, which is pretty standard. And by the way, also, while we're talking about panning, the overheads are panned hard left and right. If anybody knows why the left one goes to 64 and the right one to 63, let me know in the comments. The hi-hat is panned -27 to the left, and the right is panned an equal amount to the right. And that, for me, creates a nice stereo image. I'm panning the floor tom more to the right because if you look from the player's perspective, the 10-inch tom is actually not really to the left. It's more to the right from the player. But in terms of the whole kit, it sounds good if you pan it slightly to the left. But then the floor tom is off to the right by more than the 10-inch is to the left. So I always like to pan the floor tom more than the rack tom in order to keep it realistic. And with that being done, we can now listen to the whole drum mix without the plugins on the drum bus. Oh no, sorry, we have to talk about the room too. So this is the room mic. And all I'm doing here is removing just a little bit of mids, 374 Hertz minus 5.5 dB. And I'm adding a little bit of room just to glue all the signals together a bit, but I'm not really using it as a reverb. In fact, this whole mix doesn't have any reverb on it, except at the very end, I added just a little bit of it. Now for the drum bus. As you can see, I have 4 plugins on that. Some compression, some EQ, some more distortion, and then a little bit of reverb. First, let's listen to it without these plugins. One thing you'll see is that the needle, the level meter is equally high for both bass drum and snare. That's one thing I like to make sure when mixing, is that the kick drum and the snare are at the same level, the same volume, but also subjectively equally present. And by that I mean they have the same amount of cut. They're not like, for instance, one thing that can happen is if your bass drum doesn't have enough high frequencies in it, it'll show up here on the level meter at a certain volume, and the snare might be equally loud. But if the bass drum doesn't have the attack, it's going to be unaudible if you don't use speakers that have the low end response, although that meter is at the same volume. So I always like to make sure that A, the meter is the same, and B, they're equally present subjectively. But now for the compression, Here again, I'm using about 4 to 1, about 29 milliseconds, and about 600 milliseconds for release, which is the longest release of any compressor that I have on this mix. And that is to make sure that I'm getting a little bit more sustain from the cymbals. If this was too short, the cymbals would get a little bit more lost. But this way, when the bass drum activates the compressor, it's gonna release in a way that fits the cymbal sustain. Also, you'll notice I switched over from the vintage Fed compressor, which I had before, to the Platinum Digital compressor. Sometimes I like to just compare different compressors and choose the one that sounds the best, and in this case, I used that one. But that's totally interchangeable too. So with compression, we have this. There on the cymbal head, I think you noticed it. The needle goes down, and then as it comes, or it goes this way, and then as it comes back, the cymbal is ringing out, which I think glues the whole kit together quite nicely. The next EQ is boosting some more low end and also some more high end here at 10K. And these changes are made by listening back to my version of the drum mix with the playback on and the original, and just comparing what I was hearing. And I'll get into that in a second when we look at the analyzer here too. But for now, let's just leave it at that. Next up, we have the distortion plugin once again. Here I'm not even using any drive, I'm just using the volume that's there from the mixing so far, and distorting it just a little bit in order to compress it as well and get just a little bit more character on it. As you can hear and see with the distortion on, everything is just a little bit more present. And also if you look at the level meter, it's limited, like I said before. It's not exceeding a certain level anymore, no matter if it's kick or snare or both of them at the same time. And lastly, some chroma verb. I didn't touch these knobs, I didn't touch the pre-delay, I just set the decay to 2 seconds and added 10% of that. I think especially the last two plugins, the distortion and the reverb, really make the mix work. Like this, it's also a working drum mix, but it's kind of boring. But like this, that same mix has a lot more character and sounds a lot more exciting. Now, before going to the overdubs, let's take a listen to everything with the playback on and take a look at the level meter. As you can hear, I just switched on the original recording for reference. One thing I like to do here is pick out some key frequencies and make sure they're equally loud in the original and my version. So the first one we're looking at is 45 Hertz. It's the bass drum fundamental. As you can see, both of them go to minus 20 dB here on the scale. The next one would be this, the snare drum fundamental. It's going to -15. And then some of the highs. So the right cymbal is between -30 and -25. That's also the same. So by doing this with a couple of key frequencies, looking across the whole frequency spectrum, I'm making sure that not only the mix sounds the same to me subjectively, but also works the same way with a set of speakers and on any device you listen back to it. All that's left to do now is check the overdubs. So the first one here is the phone overdub that I'm using for the snare, the marching snare thing. Sounds like this. So what I'm doing here is first adjusting the gain, because we didn't touch the gain for that microphone when we recorded it. It was set for the loud playing, and this marching snare is a lot softer, so I'm gaining it up here. And then I'm cutting 3 frequencies. The first one is a resonance at around 290 Hertz, -12 dB, quite a lot. Another one at 370 roughly, -13 dB. And then I'm cutting at 3.4K, -5 dB. So let me switch those cuts off. As you can see, the 2 peaks are here, and they're not really sounding good. So with these 2, I'm cutting them. And then the other one is this peak. So this EQ makes it louder and prettier. Then I'm using some distortion on it. Quite a bit of drive, 26 dB. And also I'm rolling off some highs at 8.4K. So that's that, just a crushed mid-rangey snare. Next up we have the tambourine, which I call tambourine. It might be some like a bell shaker in the original. I'm not exactly sure, but I did it with the tambourine. So we have an EQ, which removes everything below a certain frequency, or basically it just isolates the tambourine frequencies. Also here I don't have a lot of highs on it because it sounds, kind of rolled off in the original. It's just a layer. And then I'm also removing some of the resonance from our specific tambourine at 4.8K. You can actually see the peak here. Without it would be like this. But it's like this. And this is way too much highs. So that now comes close to the original. And then also I am shortening up the signal quite a bit. And the reason I'm not using a gate for this is I want to get all the dynamic response of the tambourine as it was. I just want to shorten the signal no matter what the volume of it is. So I'm using the enveloper once again. I'm removing all of the release here, and I have that set to 290 milliseconds. As you can hear, it just shortens up the signal. And then I also have that pan right, because that's where it was set on the kit. Then I have the cymbal swells panned equally to the left, because that's the cymbal I played for the swells. Just like on the overheads, over here you can see the same EQ is present here. I also did the low cut, and I also did the high boost. I just copied the settings from the left overhead, because that's the mic that is responsible for the cymbal swells. Adjusted the level accordingly. And then lastly, we have the tom overdubs. They're panned 26 to the left and 36 to the right. And for those, we used some different toms than the ones on the kit. That's why the EQing is slightly different. I'm removing some fundamental here on the 10-inch one, and I'm adding some attack at 6K. And then I added a lot more attack at 6K because they're very attacky and they don't have a lot of tone actually. And then I added some reverb. I was too lazy to create a send and then a reverb channel, so I just added the plugin, which is very handy because it has the dry and wet knob separate from one another. And then the decay of 2 seconds and the pre-delay of 8 milliseconds is the same compared to the one on the drum bus. The reason I did that was to make sure it sounds coherent and to simulate it being in the same room. Yeah. And then the idea is the same for the second tom. I just adjusted the gain a little bit because for some reason it was gained a bit differently. And then I also boosted some attack, boosted some more attack, and added the same amount of reverb. So listening back to all of the drums now, we have the final result. Okay, and that's everything I did for Set Fire to the Rain. The other mix I made for the video was the one where I recreated the Instagram video of Ash Soan, so let's check that out as well now. Okay, so this is the session that I made for the Instagram video. As you can see, it's the same basic setup as before, but I'm not using all of the mics. Actually, I'm not using any overheads. I'm just using the hi-hat, snare top and bottom. This time I used the kick out mic. Then I also have the 2 toms, but they're not being used. So they're just for the demonstration part in the video. So for this video, we don't need to look at those. And then also there is no room. So it's actually a very simple thing. The most attention I paid to the snare top mic. But let's start from left to right. So here's the hi-hat dry. Now to isolate that, I'm doing a low cut here, and then I'm also cutting some roughly 6K and boosting some roughly 9K. Just going back and forth between my version and the original and making sure it sounds the same. Then we have another EQ, which adds more highs, 13K and 8K. And then lastly, we have the enveloper once again, which in this case I used to make or to shorten up the hi-hat. So I did that by removing or turning the gain down to -74% and having the release set at 160 milliseconds. So everything where the hi-hat rings out, even though it's closed, is lowered down in volume significantly. And then I'm also removing some of the attack as well, just to tighten up the sound a lot. So that's that. Now is where it's gonna get interesting. I left the phase flipped on the snare mic just because it worked earlier and I didn't mess around with that anymore. Let's just take a quick listen to the snare dry. So first EQ looks like this. Just like before, I'm cutting below the fundamental. I'm cutting some mids here. I'm also cutting a little bit at 1.3K. And I'm boosting some attack and snare wire activity from 6K to about 12, I would say, this boost. So it gives it a lot more presence. And then compressing that. With about the same settings as before. Ratio and attack remain the same amount of compression, and then a release of 170 milliseconds. Fits this snare very well, I found. Next up, I'm using probably the most important plugin in this chain, and that is the distortion. The distortion to me does two things. It first of all gives the drum or the sound the character of the original. You know, it's crushed, so we're getting some of the crushedness here. But then it also compresses the signal a lot, which is important because it makes the rim shots and the ghost notes sound almost exactly the same. So a lot of drive, a lot of output gain reduction, -12 dB to make sure it's the same volume with the plugin on and off. And then I also roll off some of the highs. I think with this plugin on, it actually sounds louder, even though if you look at the level here, it's not actually louder, it's actually lower in volume. The peaks go up a lot more with the plugin off. So this adds a lot of compression and some character. Next up, we have another EQ. I'm removing some fundamental here. I'm also, again, cutting below the fundamental because the distortion added some artificial low end. Then I'm boosting this frequency because it's so present in the original that I had to bring that out in my mix as well. In this case, it's 376 Hertz. I'm boosting 8 decibels of that. And I'm also cutting some resonance here at 1.4K and some at 2K. I'm guessing this was probably the tuning of the original snare head that Ash recorded. For some reason, ours was not as present, so I had to bring that out here, which normally you wouldn't see this kind of an EQ move. But for me, in order to get close to this sound, I had to do it. And then, lastly, another very important plugin is a gate. Usually, when you mix drums, you would put the gate at the very top of the signal chain to clean up the signal from for instance, some hi-hat bleed or maybe guitar amps in the same room, whatever. But in this case, I'm adding the gate at the very end, and I think Ash is doing the same, which is unusual, but it works in this case because the compression and distortion are compressing our snare signal so much that all of the hits sound almost the same, or almost equally loud. And if you then gate that, you can adjust the length of the sound with the gate. And that only works because it's so compressed. So the gate is more sound shaping than cleaning up of the signal in this case. I have the threshold adjusted pretty strongly, so it's really only getting all of the hits. And I have the hold setting all the way down and 30 milliseconds of release and 3 milliseconds of attack, so it doesn't give you that digital crack of not having a fade in. But this really cleans up the signal and makes it sound very electronic, actually, I think. Very unnatural, but pretty cool. I think the distortion and the gate are the defining plugins of this sound. Then lastly, I'm using another EQ here to boost a little bit more of a resonance frequency from the original, in this case 580 Hertz, and also a bit of high frequency presence at 5.3K. So the snare now sounds like this. As you can hear, the ghost notes and the rim shots are almost the same volume. The sound is very short, very clean. Pretty interesting, I think, and pretty creative of Ash to come up with this kind of a signal chain with the gate at the end. Okay, next up we have the snare bottom. This is actually very not special. Just a low cut at 2.5K. That's it. Sounds like a snare, I guess. And then for the bass drum, I'm getting that right away to make sure that I'm getting just the bass drum hits and none of the snare in the bass drum mic, because as you can see, I'm using the outside mic here because that had a little bit more mids, which will be important later on. So I'm getting that just to clean up the signal. And then I'm EQing that. I'm boosting some 60 Hertz, which is the fundamental of the drum and where the low end is compared to the original. Removing some low mids here. And then I'm also boosting at 400, which is pretty unusual, but important to this sound because it sounds it has a lot of presence in the low end, but it's also very mid-rangey because that's where it has its attack. It's not like a rock attack at 4000 Hertz, but it's a mid attack at 400. Then I'm distorting that as well. 6 dB of drive, rolling off some highs. And then one last EQ. I'm boosting a little bit more low end. I'm cutting a little bit more low mids, and I'm boosting a lot more mids at 424 in this case, almost 10 dB to get the mid-range attack from the original. If I had done this before the distortion plugin, some of this mid stuff would get lost and distorted and not be as present as it is, or as it has to be in the end. That's why I'm boosting it after the distortion plugin. And now let's take a listen to all of that with the drum bus plugins being off. Already sounds pretty close, but I'm doing just a little bit more here. So the first thing is this EQ move. which is just a resonance frequency that I cut. Then I'm compressing everything again. Again, I switched, or I compared some of the different compressor settings here, and I happen to like this one. So I adjusted it the same way as before. This always works for me, 4:1 and 29 milliseconds of attack. 230 of release. As you can see, the compressor is reacting mostly to the kick drum. And again, I'm making sure that it's living right between 0 and -5 dB of gain reduction. The next EQ is boosting just a little bit more low end. If I had boosted this before the compressor would react even more to the low end of the bass drum and it would get lost again. So I'm boosting it afterwards. And then everything is being distorted once again, just a little bit, just to glue everything together and make sure that the levels are the same for kick and snare. No roll off on the highs, no extra drive, just the volume that's already there is enough to activate this distortion here. And the output volume is adjusted in such a way that the end volume is the same compared to the original. So with that being done, here's the whole mix. Also, you'll notice that everything is mono, except for the hi-hat, which is panned just a little bit to the left. Now let's turn on the loop and compare it with the original. It's as close as I could get anyway. So again, we can now compare the key frequencies. Let's start at 60 Hertz. It's very loud, almost exceeding -15 dB here on the level. And actually the attack of the mid frequencies for the bass drum are equally loud. They're also going up to -15. So next up, let's take a look at the snare. So its attack, or its fundamental is here. Sorry. The resonance is also at the same level. So both the kick fundamental, the kick attack in the mids, the snare fundamental, and its overtones are all living in the same area. They're all going up to -15 dB. And I try to match that. The kick attack is actually very, very close to the snare fundamental, which I think is very interesting in this sound. And everything is going around to -15. Okay, I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more of these mixing breakdowns too, just tell us in the comments, like and subscribe, and see you next time. Take care.